He had everything money could buy: yachts, mansions, luxury cars. But one woman's unshakable purity showed him something priceless, that not everything valuable can be purchased. He was a man whose very name could make cities tremble. Every newspaper headline carried his empire's triumphs record: breaking profits, acquisitions that reshaped industries, and charitable donations that were more about prestige than compassion. He owned penthouses that kissed the skyline and cars that purred like tamed beasts. Yet, despite his empire of gold, every night he found himself staring at the ceiling in silence, surrounded by luxury but haunted by an ache he could never quite name. The laughter of guests faded after the parties ended, and the echo of his own footsteps in marble halls became the cruelest reminder that wealth could buy walls, but not warmth. He had grown up believing that money was the cure to all wounds. It was his shield, his sword, his validation. When he was young, he watched his parents argue not about love, but about inheritance and legacy. So, he built his fortune as an act of rebellion, a declaration to the world that he didn't need anyone. But the higher he climbed, the lonelier it became. Friends became business partners, lovers became distractions, and happiness became something he postponed, always promising himself he'd find it after the next deal, the next success, the next billion. But that next never came. His victories were grand, but his soul was silent. The applause of the world was deafening, yet it never filled the hollow inside him. It was on an ordinary day, or so he thought, that he met her. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, or dripping with jewels like the women he usually entertained. She was simple, with a soft voice and eyes that didn't flicker with greed when they looked at him. She wasn't impressed by his reputation, and that, in itself, intrigued him. She worked at a small cafe near one of his corporate towers, serving people with a warmth that seemed almost foreign to him. When she spoke, she listened. When she smiled, it was genuine. There was no performance, no hidden agenda. He found himself returning to that cafe again and again, not for the coffee, but for the calm her presence gave him, the kind of peace that money could never provide. The more he observed her, the more he noticed how different she was from his world. She had no riches, yet she seemed rich in everything that mattered. She spoke kindly to strangers, laughed with children, and carried herself with quiet grace even when life tested her. He once overheard her talking to an elderly customer who couldn't pay for his meal, and without hesitation, she covered the bill with her own meager earnings. There was no announcement, no expectation of praise, just compassion. That single act shook something inside him. Here was a woman who had nothing but gave as though she had everything, while he, who had everything, couldn't remember the last time he gave without expecting something in return. At first, he didn't understand why he kept thinking about her. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe even amusement, that someone so ordinary could occupy his thoughts. But it wasn't amusement, it was longing. The kind of longing that frightens a man who has built his entire life on control. He realized he didn't crave her body. He craved her simplicity, her peace, her purpose. He began to question himself, when had he lost that spark? When had life stopped being about living and started being about winning? He had spent decades proving his worth to the world, but one glance into her humble eyes made him realize he didn't even know what his worth truly was. For the first time, he felt poor not in money but in meaning. That realization was terrifying. He had built an empire on the belief that wealth equaled power and power equaled happiness. But standing before her, he saw that power without purpose was emptiness in disguise. The world had taught him to measure his life in assets, but she made him see the poverty of his spirit. He began to notice the masks people wore around him, smiles that hid greed, handshakes that hid envy. And in contrast, her sincerity felt like a mirror he could no longer avoid. Every time he tried to return to his old life, the fast cars, the glamorous events, the glittering company of women who saw him as a prize, something felt off. The champagne didn't sparkle as much, the laughter felt rehearsed, the applause, once addictive, began to sound hollow. He started questioning the empire he had built. What was it all for? He realized he had never built it for joy, he had built it for validation, for escape, for fear of being ordinary. But she, in her quiet existence, taught him that ordinariness wasn't weakness, it was peace. And peace, he now knew, was rarer than diamonds. Every encounter with her peeled away another layer of his vanity, revealing a man he had long buried beneath ambition. He began to feel emotions he had forgotten: humility, gratitude, even vulnerability. Those feelings frightened him, yet he couldn't turn away. Because for the first time, he felt alive, not because of what he owned, but because of what he was beginning to understand. He didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of his transformation, the slow unraveling of a man who had everything but nothing that mattered. It was the quiet before a storm of self-discovery, where he would soon learn that love, innocence, and truth were far stronger currencies than power, lust, or pride. But for now, all he could do was stand in the presence of a woman who didn't chase wealth and realize that all his wealth had been chasing an illusion. For most of his life, the billionaire's word had been law. People didn't refuse him, they competed to please him. He was used to getting what he wanted, whether it was a business deal, a piece of art, or a woman. His confidence was magnetic, his charm carefully perfected. So, when he finally approached her, the woman whose quiet presence had lingered in his thoughts for weeks, he did it with the same arrogance that had always worked in his favor. He leaned on his charm like a weapon, certain that one smile and a few sweet promises would bring her to her knees. But this time, the weapon met its match not in hostility, but in innocence. He invited her to dinner at one of his exclusive restaurants, where the table gleamed under crystal chandeliers and violins played softly in the background. When she arrived, she looked around shyly, clearly out of place among the glittering crowd. Yet, there was no shame in her demeanor, only grace. He admired that at first, but as the night went on, his motives grew clearer. Between sips of wine, he leaned closer and said words he had said to countless women before, words laced with flattery, charm, and unspoken intentions. He told her she was beautiful, that she could have anything she wanted if she stayed close to him. When he touched her hand, she didn't pull away in disgust, but she did look at him not with desire, not with admiration, but with disappointment. Her silence made him uneasy. He was not used to being met with silence. Women usually blushed, smiled, or surrendered to his charisma. But she just looked at him calmly, almost sadly, as if she could see through the layers of charm and arrogance that even he had forgotten were there. When he finally asked, "What's wrong?" her voice was gentle, but her words struck like lightning. "Nothing's wrong," she said softly, "except that you think I can be bought." He froze. No one had ever said that to him before. People had joked about his wealth, envied it, even resented it, but no one had ever confronted it. She wasn't mocking him, she wasn't angry, and she certainly wasn't impressed. She was just honest. The innocence in her tone made his arrogance feel small, almost childish. For the first time, he realized how pathetic his words must have sounded, offering material things to a woman whose eyes held something far greater than luxury: integrity. He tried to recover his composure, smiling as if to brush off her remark. "You misunderstand me," he said quickly. "I just want to take care of you, make your life easier." But she shook her head with quiet certainty. "You can buy my time," she replied, "but not my soul. You can buy comfort, but not respect. And you can buy a body, but never love." Her words sliced through the air with the gentleness of truth. They weren't said with anger, but they landed heavier than any insult he'd ever heard. In that moment, she wasn't just rejecting him, she was teaching him. And he didn't know what to do with that. For a man used to control, her refusal wasn't merely a no. It was a mirror held up to his own emptiness. He saw himself reflected in that mirror, powerful but lonely, wealthy but hollow, confident but directionless. He should have been offended. He should have walked away. perhaps thrown money on the table as a gesture of defiance. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there silent, humbled, and strangely grateful. For the first time, someone had dared to tell him what no one else ever would. She wasn't afraid of losing him because she had never needed him. That was the difference, and that difference was magnetic in a way he couldn't explain. Her innocence wasn't naivety, it was strength. The kind of strength that didn't shout, didn't flaunt, didn't seek attention. It simply stood firm in its truth. The next morning, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. "You can buy my time, but not my soul." He repeated them over and over, as if testing them against the foundation of his life. He thought about the women who had come before her, the ones who smiled for his cameras, the ones who pretended to love him because of what he could offer. They had all said yes too easily. But this woman, this simple cafe worker, had done something none of them ever had. She had said no not out of rejection, but out of principle. And that no carried more power than any yes he'd ever received. Days turned into weeks, and though he tried to distract himself with work and wealth, something inside him had changed. He began to notice the falseness around him, how people's smiles bent under greed, how laughter in high places always hid calculation. Her innocence had spoiled his appetite for the artificial world he had built. Every conversation with her had felt like standing in sunlight after years in a cold room. Now that light haunted him. It burned away his arrogance, leaving behind only the rawness of truth. And yet, that truth didn't humiliate him, it awakened him. Her quiet defiance made him want to be someone worthy of her respect. He realized that her innocence was not weakness, but power, the kind of power that doesn't conquer others, but heals them. And perhaps without even trying, she had done what no rival, no competitor, no lover had ever achieved. She had conquered him. For weeks he tried to forget her. He surrounded himself with everything the world said should make a man happy: fine wine, luxury, and women whose beauty could silence a room. Yet, no matter how many faces he saw, hers kept appearing between the shadows of his thoughts. It wasn't her beauty that haunted him, though she was beautiful in an unpolished, effortless way. It was her eyes. Eyes that looked at him not with desire, but with understanding. He couldn't explain it. She had refused him, embarrassed him even, and yet, instead of anger, he felt something far more dangerous: longing. At first, he mistook that longing for lust. After all, that was what he knew best. He had spent years mastering the art of desire, how to charm, seduce, and possess. Women had always been trophies in his life, temporary victories that validated his worth. He knew how to touch, how to whisper, how to make promises he'd never keep. But with her, none of that worked. Her innocence had exposed the shallowness of his old pursuits. He began to realize that what he felt wasn't physical hunger, it was a spiritual ache, something deeper than the body could satisfy. It unsettled him, this new feeling that couldn't be tamed or bought. He found himself going to the cafe more often, not to impress her this time, but simply to be near her. He would sit quietly at the corner table, watching her move between customers, her apron dusted with flour, her smile lighting up even the dullest morning. She greeted everyone with the same kindness, never favoring anyone, never pretending. He noticed how she comforted an old woman who came in crying one day, and how she shared her lunch with a hungry child the next. There was no show in her goodness, it flowed from her naturally, like sunlight warming everything in its reach. And in that warmth, the billionaire began to thaw. It was strange to him, this peace he felt just watching her. He had always associated women with passion and conquest, but now he found joy in silence. Sometimes she would sit across from him during her break, and they would talk not about business or power or wealth, but about simple things. Books she liked, places she wanted to see, dreams that didn't involve diamonds or fame. She would laugh easily, and when she did, he realized how rare that sound was in his world, a laugh untainted by pretense. He began to crave that sound more than any kiss he'd ever stolen. It wasn't lust anymore. It was love in its quietest, purest form, but love frightened him. It demanded honesty, something he had never given anyone before. He began to question himself. Could a man like him, who had built his life on taking, ever deserve someone who gave so freely? He wanted to tell her everything about his loneliness, his fears, the emptiness behind his success, but the words stuck in his throat. Vulnerability felt like weakness to him, and yet, every time she looked at him, he felt his armor cracking. He wanted to be seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man, a flawed, broken man searching for redemption. And perhaps that was why he kept returning. She saw him before he even saw himself. There came a day when she asked him, gently, "Why do you come here every day?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. He could have said he liked the coffee, or that he enjoyed their conversations, but those would have been lies. So he said the only truth he could manage, "Because when I'm here, I feel human." She looked at him, her expression softening, as if she understood exactly what he meant. And in that moment, he realized something profound. She didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't care about his status or his sins. She only cared that he was real. That realization hit him harder than any business failure ever had. For years, he had hidden behind power, pretending he didn't need anyone. But love stripped away that illusion. It forced him to confront his own heart, a heart that had been silent for so long. It almost forgot how to beat. He began to see the difference between wanting and loving. Wanting was selfish, loving was surrender. Wanting consumed, loving completed. He understood now that lust was about taking, but love was about giving, not gifts or money, but the courage to be honest, the willingness to care without expecting something in return. And so, he began to change quietly and without announcing it to the world. He started doing things for her, not to impress her, but to share her world. He would bring food for the children she helped, or spend afternoons repairing the cafe's leaky roof just so she wouldn't have to close early. He didn't boast about it or demand gratitude. He found joy in the simplicity of giving, a joy he had never known before. The man who once sought pleasure in power now found peace in kindness. He realized that love, real love, doesn't roar. It whispers, it doesn't take, it teaches, and with every passing day his lust faded like a shadow at sunrise. What replaced it wasn't fiery or possessive, it was calm, steady, and alive. He didn't want to own her anymore. He just wanted to be worthy of her. For the first time, he wasn't chasing a woman. He was chasing the man he wanted to become. And though he couldn't yet say the words out loud, deep within him, he knew he wasn't in love with her body. He was in love with her soul. Change, for a man like him, had never come easily. He had built his entire existence on control over his wealth, his image, his emotions, and everyone around him. But now, something inside him had shifted. The man who once commanded boardrooms and silenced rivals found himself quietly sitting beside her, watching her hand out food to hungry children, or laughing as she wiped flour off her apron. She didn't even realize she was changing him. She wasn't trying to. Her compassion was effortless, a part of her very being, and it was that simplicity that disarmed him more than any power could. He started helping her at first in small, unnoticed ways. When he saw the cafe's supply truck break down one morning, he called a mechanic and paid the bill before she even found out. When one of the orphans she cared for fell ill, he made sure the child was taken to the best hospital, but quietly, under a false name, so she wouldn't feel indebted. For the first time, his actions weren't driven by pride or ego. They came from a place he had long buried, genuine care. He didn't need her gratitude. The joy he felt watching her smile, unaware that he had made her burdens lighter, was enough. Her compassion was contagious. It forced him to look at the world he had ignored for so long. The homeless people he used to drive past without a second glance suddenly had faces, stories, and struggles. The workers in his own company, whose names he never learned, became real to him. He began to visit the shelters she volunteered at first awkwardly, unsure how to fit into her world. He would stand by the doorway, out of place in his tailored suits, watching her serve food to the poor with a tenderness that made him feel like a stranger in his own city. But slowly, he rolled up his sleeves and joined her. The billionaire who once signed $1 million deals was now handing out soup, listening to people's stories, and realizing that money could build walls but compassion broke them. The more time he spent with her, the more he understood that compassion wasn't charity. Charity was giving because you could. Compassion was giving because you cared. He had donated millions before hospitals bore his name. Schools carried his logo, but none of it had ever filled him with this quiet peace. When she helped others, it wasn't about recognition. It was about connection. She would sit with a beggar and talk as if speaking to an old friend, or listen to a struggling mother's fears as though they were her own. Her empathy didn't distinguish between rich and poor, clean or unclean. It was unconditional. Watching her, he realized how small his heart had been all these years. And yet, this transformation wasn't without pain. Compassion demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability meant facing the truth about who he had been. The more he opened his eyes to suffering, the more guilt he felt for the years he had spent ignoring it. He remembered the employees he had fired without thought, the people whose lives he had crushed in his pursuit of success. Those memories haunted him now, not as regrets, but as lessons. She never judged him for his past, but her kindness made him want to make amends. He started changing the way he ran his business, raising wages, improving working conditions, creating scholarships for children who couldn't afford education. Every decision became personal. Every act of kindness became a step toward forgiveness, not from her, but from himself. He began to see her compassion not as weakness, but as power, the kind of power he had never understood. In his world, power was control. In hers, power was care. She could move people's hearts without raising her voice, inspire loyalty without offering reward, and heal wounds with nothing more than presence. And the more he observed her, the more he realized that love, in its purest form, was just compassion given a face. He found himself drawn not to her beauty, but to her strength, a strength born of kindness. Her compassion was her crown, and she wore it with a humility that made him question everything he had once admired in himself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned golden, they stood outside the shelter, tired but peaceful after a long day of helping others. She turned to him and said softly, "Do you know why I do this?" He shook his head. She smiled faintly, "Because once someone showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it, and it changed everything." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. He understood then compassion wasn't just about helping others. It was about healing cycles of pain. Her kindness had once saved her, now her kindness was saving him. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, he looked out over the glittering city and realized how different it all felt now. The same skyline that once symbolized victory now reminded him of responsibility. He wasn't proud of his wealth anymore, he was aware of its purpose. Every light that twinkled below represented a life, a story, a soul. And he no longer wanted to rule over them, he wanted to serve them. Her compassion had transformed not just how he felt, but who he was. The walls around his heart were crumbling, replaced by something far stronger, empathy. He didn't yet know where this journey would lead. But one thing was clear. The man who once measured success in billions now measured it in smiles. And it all began with one woman whose heart was wide enough to teach him that compassion, not conquest, is what truly changes the world. He had spent his whole life believing that everything and everyone had a price. People said it as a joke, but to him, it was a rule. Power was measured by what you could buy, who you could control, and how far your influence reached. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how little those rules meant in the world she lived in. There were no contracts in her kindness, no expectations in her affection, and that terrified him, because it was something he couldn't negotiate or manipulate. He could offer her a mansion, a car, or a life of luxury, but none of it would matter if he couldn't offer her something far rarer, trust. He wanted to tell her how he felt, but every time he tried, fear stopped him. What if she thought his love was another transaction? What if she saw him as the same arrogant man she had once refused? He knew he couldn't rush her heart. He couldn't buy it or charm it open. All he could do was earn it, day by day, moment by moment. That realization humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. The man who once made empires bend was now learning to wait, to listen instead of command, to prove instead of promise. His first test came one evening when he offered to drive her home after she'd worked late at the cafe. She hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't trust him completely, it was that she was cautious with everyone. He didn't press her. He simply smiled and said, "I'll wait until you get a ride." And he did. He waited on the sidewalk until she safely left with a friend, and then quietly drove home. He didn't text her afterward, didn't demand thanks. For the first time in his life, he found peace in restraint. Because he understood that trust isn't something you take, it's something you're given when you've proven you can be trusted with it. Days turned into weeks, and their connection grew deeper, not through gifts or grand gestures, but through quiet consistency. He showed up when he said he would. He listened when she spoke. He never tried to fix her problems with money. Instead, he stood beside her as she faced them with courage. She began to see a gentleness in him that the world never had. Once, during a rainstorm, the cafe roof started leaking again. Without a word, he grabbed a bucket and stood beside her, catching water as it dripped through. They laughed together, soaked and shivering, as thunder rolled outside. It was a small, ordinary moment, but in that laughter, a bridge was built between two souls that once stood worlds apart. Still, there were moments when his old habits resurfaced. One afternoon, he surprised her with a diamond necklace, something exquisite and rare. Her reaction was not what he expected. She didn't smile or reach for it. Instead, she looked at him and said softly, "You don't need to buy me things to make me see you. I already do." Her words were kind, but they pierced him deeply. He realized painfully that she didn't want to be impressed, she wanted to be understood. That night, he placed the necklace in its box and locked it away. It was a turning point. He decided that if he wanted her heart, he would have to stop offering her the world and start offering her himself. As time passed, she began to open up about her own fears, how she'd been hurt before, how people had promised love only to vanish when it became inconvenient. He listened without interrupting, his heart breaking with every word. In those moments, he understood that trust wasn't built through perfection, but through presence. It wasn't about saying the right thing, it was about staying when things got hard. He wanted to be, that for her, not the man who dazzled her, but the man who never walked away. And slowly, he became that man. The billionaire who once measured his worth in assets, now measured it in honesty. One day, he found the courage to tell her the truth. They were sitting on a park bench, the city humming softly around them. He turned to her and said quietly, "I used to think love was about winning, but now I realize it's about earning not your admiration, but your trust." His voice trembled slightly, something it had never done before. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I promise I'll never lie to you again." She didn't respond right away. She just looked at him for a long time, as if searching his eyes for proof of the man he had become. Finally, she smiled, not the kind of smile that ends a story, but the kind that begins one. In that moment, he understood something profound. Trust isn't given in a single moment. It's built through 1,000 small choices. It's built when you show up, when you tell the truth even when it's hard, when you respect someone's boundaries without question. He had spent years building towers of glass, fragile, reflective, and hollow. But now he was building something different, something real, something slow, something human. And though he didn't yet have her heart completely, he had earned something even more precious, her belief that he might someday deserve it. Her trust became the foundation of everything that followed. It changed the way he loved, the way he worked, the way he saw himself. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man chasing power, he felt like a man becoming whole. And while he still carried the scars of his old arrogance, her trust was the light that softened them. She had shown him that hearts can't be bought, only held with care. And he, who once thought he could buy the world, was finally learning that the only thing worth earning was her trust. Love had always been a foreign language to him, one he had tried to imitate but never truly understood. He had said the words countless times before, but never meant them. To him, love had been a transaction, a game of attraction and ego, of taking what pleased him and leaving before it could become real. But with her, every rule he once followed had dissolved. The man who once measured affection in physical closeness now found himself yearning for something intangible, the quiet assurance of her presence, the safety of her silence, the way her eyes could speak without a single word. He had never known that love could feel like peace instead of passion, or that it could heal rather than consume. As weeks turned into months, he began to see her not as the woman who had changed him, but as the mirror that revealed who he had always been beneath the arrogance. For so long, he had worn masks, the businessman, the billionaire, the conqueror. But she looked past all of that, right into the part of him he had tried to hide, the lonely boy who had grown up believing that power was the only shield against pain. Around her, he didn't have to pretend anymore. He could be vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, he discovered something beautiful, that love didn't demand perfection. It demanded truth. For the first time, he allowed himself to be seen, not as the man he was expected to be, but as the man he was becoming. Their bond deepened slowly, like dawn spreading across a sleeping city. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions, only small moments that built a life between them. She would bring him coffee after a long day, and he would fix the flickering light in her cafe without her asking. They shared laughter in the most ordinary places, a park bench, a rainy street, a crowded bus, and each simple moment taught him what the world's wealth had never been able to buy: contentment. He learned that love wasn't about constant excitement or endless passion. It was about finding joy in the everyday, about choosing someone again and again, even when the world offered 1,000 distractions. But even as their connection grew, he carried the weight of his past. There were days when guilt would grip him, the memory of lives he'd affected in his pursuit of success, the emptiness he'd left in others while chasing his own desires. Yet she never judged him for it. When he confessed his mistakes one evening, his voice breaking as he spoke, she didn't offer words of forgiveness, she simply took his hand. That small gesture spoke louder than any sermon. In her eyes, he saw understanding, not approval, but acceptance. She didn't erase his past, she helped him live with it. Through a quiet love, he began to forgive himself. He realized that love was not a reward for goodness, but a reason to become good. She never asked him to change, but he changed anyway, because loving her made him want to be better. He started spending more time in the world. She had shown him the world beyond glitter and greed. He helped rebuild an orphanage, funded education for underprivileged children, and sat among them, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. The children adored him, not for his money, but for his laughter, a sound that had once been foreign to his own ears. In their smiles, he saw reflections of the man he had become, and in her eyes, he saw the man he still hoped to be. One evening, as they walked along the riverbank, the city lights shimmering in the water, he stopped and looked at her. There was no elaborate plan, no ring, no crowd, just the two of them and the quiet hum of the night. He said softly, "Do you know what you've done to me?" She tilted her head, smiling slightly. "You've taught me what love really means. It's not about wanting someone, it's about understanding them. It's not about having everything, it's about having one person and realizing that's enough." His voice trembled as he spoke, and she didn't reply. She just stepped closer and rested her head against his chest. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. It was perfect as it was. From that night onward, he stopped being the man who sought control. He no longer needed to conquer the world, he was finally at peace within it. His days were still filled with responsibilities, his business still vast, but the hunger that once drove him had faded. He didn't chase wealth anymore. He used it to create change. His boardroom decisions now carried empathy. His employees noticed the difference, the kindness in his tone, the softness in his words. The same man who once demanded results now asked his people if they were happy. He was learning that love, when it's real, doesn't just stay between two people, it spills into everything they touch. Her love had redefined his understanding of strength. Once, he believed strength meant never bending. Now, he knew it meant learning how to bend without breaking. Once, he thought love was possession. Now, he understood it was freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to be human, to be whole. He had spent his life mastering the art of earning money. She had taught him the art of earning hearts. And in doing so, she gave him something no empire ever could: peace. He didn't know what the future would hold, whether life would test them or time would change them. But he did know one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid to love. Because love had stopped being something he chased and had become something he lived. And so, in the end, this wasn't just a story about a billionaire and a woman who lived in simplicity. It was the story of two souls who met from opposite ends of the world, one who had everything but meaning, and another who had nothing but truth. It was the story of how love, in its purest form, is not about desire, possession, or perfection. It is about the courage to see another person as they truly are, flawed, human, and worthy of being loved anyway. He had once believed that money could buy hearts, but she taught him that love cannot be purchased. It must be earned through trust, patience, and honesty. She didn't change him by force. She changed him by example. Her kindness disarmed his arrogance. Her innocence silenced his greed. And in her gentle truth, he found what all his wealth could never give him: peace. The man who had spent years conquering the world finally learned that the greatest victory of all is to conquer one's own heart. He discovered that love is not a transaction, it's a transformation. It takes the coldest soul and teaches it to feel again. It takes the proudest mind and teaches it to kneel not in defeat, but in devotion. And perhaps that is what this story truly reminds us of, that love is not found in luxury or power, but in the small, silent moments of sincerity. The way someone listens when no one else does, the way they stay when everyone else walks away, the way they believe in you, even when you've forgotten how to believe in yourself. In a world that often measures worth in money and success, this story whispers a different truth: that the greatest wealth we can ever possess is the heart that chooses us not for what we have, but for who we are. So when you leave here today, remember, this love doesn't make you weak. It makes you real, because the heart that learns to love is the heart that finally learns to live.